big enterprises, they think in a very waterfall way, but how do you respond and try to help your team operate that way?
In our world, we're building integrations to build a new feature set for our customer, do one gigantic release.
I actually heard in everything you just said an argument for Waterfall. Really, the question is that actually a bad thing?
There's a larger stage to research on to figure out where did the problem go wrong? Where was the issue? Where was it introduced? Who did it? Like how did this happen?
Welcome to Tech Council, your go-to podcast for mastering the art of building in the enterprise world. Join hosts Duncan and Jason Ehmke as they unpack the strategies, tools, and insights you need to drive innovation at scale. Brought to you by DevGrid, we're here to empower developers, tech leaders, and enterprise builders. Hit subscribe, and let's dive into today's episode.
So we're recording this on May 29th. We just released our first episodes, a few days ago. That was
getting some good feedback already.
Yeah, it's funny getting texts from people who know some of those stories, and yes. I haven't had anybody tell me that I'm completely making things up yet, which is good. But it's been we appreciate the positive feedback, and it's been lovely.
Yeah, the feedback I've gotten some texts about. Yeah, these are the things that we talked about in our one-on-ones. These are the things that you should be talking about in your one-on-ones, either with your manager or your direct reports. These shouldn't be taboo topics.
Yeah, for sure. So, obviously we're trying to keep it as real as we can, right? So today we actually, you and I mean, what was it? 2.5 hours yesterday. We were in a conversation trying to figure out, we're a software startup. We're trying to make prioritization decisions about what we're going to work on and how we think about the work and all those different things. And trying to make fast decisions and move as fast as possible, without adding overhead and at the same time, like how much overhead do we need in terms of process and planning and all those different things. So, and at the end of it, we realized, man, I wish we just recorded this conversation. We could have edited out like 2 bits and had a great podcast. And so, I think what we wanted to try to do today was sort of recapture that conversation a little bit, but then also take it to other contexts, right? Because we have a very specific context of the small dev team building a SaaS product versus, our constituency or the people we're really trying to help are usually larger companies and dev teams in those contexts. So, I'll kick it off and say the fundamental question, I'll frame the problem and then you tell me what you think. So I think the fundamental problem we have is software delivery over the last, say, 10 to 15 years has definitely migrated into believing that this concept of incremental value, highly iterative, fast delivery, where you can sort of pivot and be agile is the best way. And I think, most everybody agrees with that to a degree. But then the challenge is, in big enterprises, generally speaking, they don't think that way, right? Like you're an IT shop for a bank, as an example, because that's a good context that we have. Those executives don't think that way. They think about, I'm doing a business initiative. I'm getting millions of dollars of funding. One of the things that needs to happen is the IT piece, where the software engineering teams, the technology teams are building some capabilities. But I'm thinking about this 18 months, 24-month program. And so they think in a very waterfall way. If you're an app manager on the receiving end of that waterfall thought process, like what do you do when you kind of look at it and say, well, we know that that's not exactly right, but how do you respond and try to help your team operate that way?
Well, there's 2 minds here, and that's where I went yesterday when we were having the conversation of how do we deliver business value faster? And there's 2 parts to those conversations. It's we're delivering value to our customer. Sure. That's everyone's goal, is to deliver value to a customer faster. But you have to look at the whole start to finish of what you're building. It's in our world, we're building integrations to build a new feature set for our customer. But you could look at it that way of, well, I need A and B and C and D and E and F and G, and then you do one gigantic release. That's one way of looking at it. But then you start to snowball. And you build up a significant backlog that you have to release to get this thing done, to get the new capability done. And there's a lot of weight to that. Yeah, every feature that you add, now there's no physical weight to it, but there's a weight on the team, and there's a weight on the cognitive overhead of trying to deliver these features. And every bit of scope that you add into this, it might seem insignificant at the time, but as we were talking about yesterday, there's a long tail of that. Like, well, I'm just adding a field. Why is that a problem? But then there's multiple effects that go into why that's a problem for the team, and how other multiple other individuals can be affected by just this one new field. But and so that happens once, twice, three times. There's that overload and overhead that happens of not only do you have to think about the original feature set, but now every other decision that you would make, you have to consider these new fields, and there's a weight to it that it loads up to the team. And so, walking back a little bit from that, what's the minimum releasable feature set that you could have in front of a customer? It might not be inherently useful, it might not be significantly useful, but how do you make it such a small chunk that you can iterate on top of that while reducing that cognitive overhead to the delivery team, to make sure that you're delivering a feature set that you can quickly iterate on and move on to the next piece and swarm as a one cohesive unit, versus we've got this gigantic feature that we've got all hands on deck, pivot back and forth. Okay, well, you're not ready, I'm going to work on something else. You're not ready, I'm going to work on something else. By that time, you're all over the place. You're not working as a small, nimble hit squad. You're working as a bunch of people working on one gigantic project, hoping to figure it out and build the airplane as it's falling off the bridge.
So this is good, because I want to argue with you about a bunch of that. So this will be fun. So like, how do I'm trying to collect my thoughts here, because I was trying to listen and not think ahead. So the thing that's interesting, like, I actually heard in everything you just said an argument for Waterfall, right? And not that you're making that argument, but I think underneath it, and this is part of the conversation we had yesterday, so bringing it forward, right? It's like, what is the merit of, okay, if I've got what I think the scope is, and you just make up timeframes, right? Like, so I think this thing's going to take 2 weeks because of the scope that we've lined out. Once you get into the work, you discover, there's maybe 3 or 4 more days worth of work to add on, right? So it becomes like 30%, 50% longer. And it's like, okay, now, is that a problem? Is that, because you use the word problem, it's like, really the question is like, is that actually a bad thing? Because ultimately, the reason, I think from a overall value standpoint, the reason you want to deliver smaller things, there's 2 primary reasons, I think, right? Is one, you're getting incremental value sooner, right? So if you get 100 units of value for the whole thing, you're still getting more value if 10% of the way through you can get 10 units of value, and then 20 units of value, and then 30 units. So like the overall value is greater if you're getting little bits of it as you go. And so there's benefit there. But then the other real big benefit is to get feedback, right? And like, that's why you want to do things small, is to not have all of your assumptions fully baked and wait 6 months to deliver the big thing, and then find out you were totally wrong about a bunch of it, and you now have to make changes, right? So you're much more likely to be able to adjust based upon the actual market feedback as you go, right? Like, so that's the real, at least in my mind, from, if we're thinking about it purely from like a product management or a business management standpoint, that's the argument that's compelling for incremental delivery, right? Now, and then there's other reasons why, kind of what you're saying, like you're taking a very engineering centric view, which we're supposed to, of that question. It was like, well, it's easier for the team because they can do smaller things, and you're not dragging this thing out. They're not getting this kind of death march feeling of this thing. We're all working super hard on this thing that's taking weeks and weeks and months and months. And we've both all been there for projects like that, where it just feels like you're just never going to end. Versus if you can say, okay, cool, we're going to do this piece and we're going to push it, and then we'll move on to the next thing. And maybe it's related to the exact same project, or maybe it's something new, and then we come back to that. We let it soak for a month, and then get some feedback, and then come back and make some adjustments. There's opportunity there. There's novelty there. There's the things are turning over, and there's more fluidity. So there's an argument there for just developer experience and momentum to kind of keeping things small in sort of your deliverable thing, but the thing I wanted to sort of throw back to you is like, we all obsessed with Agile, but like, it is like, what's the problem with that moment of, hey, you use the example add a field, right? So in our context, I'll give a little more context to that, right? So one of the things we were talking about is, we as DevGrid, our in-jobs platform is has this unified data model is kind of like a core aspect of it, right? So we're going out into all the different tools that are even remotely related to engineering, and we're saying, okay, what is this object? What is this data model? It could be things like resources or work items or whatever, and we're designing a data model that essentially works with all the tools, right? And then we have to translate things between that. Well, that's what we found over time is that's a pretty iterative process, right? Like, we design the model based upon our expertise and our knowledge and looking at some specs and things like that. And then we build our first couple integrations against that model, and we're like, oh crap, we forgot about this, or, actually maybe we need to tweak it that way, or maybe they separate this out into another table, and all those different types of things. So I say all that to say, like, can you discuss like what you think, like, if we had two scenarios? One scenario is we take 2 weeks to really get the data model right, and we spend a bunch of time investigating that, and we try to get ahead of it as much as possible, really richly, deep research, all those types of things. And then we take 2 weeks or 3 weeks to build it. Is that better than we take a couple of days to do the data model, but we take 4.5 weeks to build it because we're having to iterate and make changes to that initial data model that we made? Like, talk about how you see those two scenarios and the pros and cons of each for me.
Yeah, so let's look at in our context here. And I think one of the fundamental problems or the solution is that you have to separate what it means to release. Now, you've got release as code release, and you've got release to a customer. So that's where I've seen a lot of the problems is that, well, we want to release at a certain phase. And then the dev teams will say, okay, well, we're going to put all the scope into this thing and we're going to release at this time. But where it wasn't being framed as what does it mean to release? And so we started to chunk things up a lot smaller. And we started to chunk things up into little individual mini phases. And the problem that we were seeing here is that we are getting gigantic releases, big bang releases, and there was problems with the release. And now there's defect resolution. There's, what happened? There's a larger stage to research on to figure out where did the problem go wrong? Where was the issue? Where was it, introduced? Who did it? Like, how did this happen? So, in this situation, well, it took a long time to dig through that and find out where the problem was. It extended our time. But what you're asking here is, in each scenario, why? Like, why is this better or worse? And so thinking about how we can make a decision today. We're making decisions today to build a new feature set or capability, and then we, to make this capability useful, we also have to integrate with a third party. Okay, great. But who's to say that third party that we're integrating with initially, that's the right one? They could be the right one today, but now we've got this 3 to 6 month build out. Oh, wait, this third party that we're integrating with actually isn't the right one anymore. So all the assumptions that we made along the way, those have to change, and we have to now integrate with
the longer the cycle, the more we have to be right? Like, that's and so that's risky. Like, the longer the cycle, the riskier all of our decisions become.
Right. And so now you've got, you integrate it with Jira, for example. And so you built your entire product experience based off of the first integration, which was Jira. Oh, wait, that's not useful anymore. We've got to use somebody else, Rally, for example. Well, Rally doesn't have all these fields. Rally doesn't have the fields that you built your entire product experience on. So now you've almost got to redesign it from the ground up to say, how would I integrate with Rally? And so where we were getting into was, what is the least amount that we can deploy on or release, like code release on, with a minimally viable product to, it's not going to be inherently useful because you still need to fill it with data, but who's to say you're going to be right in the first place with you picking Jira? You can't. And so now we've got something that is iterable, and you can iterate on it to to fix your assumptions, to enhance your data model, to enhance your usability. And then you can run some of those tasks in parallel. We've got your usability testing. You can use some seeder data. You can test out some mock information and just dump your own information in there. Have a couple people who are iterating on the user experience. And then maybe you have somebody else in the back end filling that with the first integration. Now that's going to be minimal data, but that's actually the more preferred approach because now you can iterate quicker on things. You can make better decisions faster on, well, okay, I would like this field now. Can we get that from somewhere else? Yes, fine. Just incrementally grow it. And then over time, you're building up that momentum to make quicker decisions.
Yeah. I mean, we say all the time, right? Like it's probably should be the tagline of this podcast, right? Like there are no solutions, only trade-offs, right? And so like, in everything you're describing, like it's like no matter what, you're going to have that iteration, right? Because you're just not going to get, unless there's some savant capability, there's no solutions. There's only trade-offs, right? So it's like, we're not going to invest enough time and energy to, using this example, to get the data model perfect and to investigate every single product on the market and deeply understand their data models and then come up with a good unified one like that. Like you could maybe do that, but the problem is like, and we've tried to do it that way, but ultimately what ends up happening is like you read their specs and you look at their APIs, but until you actually pull down the real life data from a customer, you don't actually know what's going on because there's enough variability in the data itself that just reading through their docs files don't give it to you. So really, until you actually start to build those integrations, you don't fully understand what it is you're doing, right? Because you don't fully understand the data. So the reality of that is then, okay, again, unless you're going to be super, super, super good about all that research up front, which we're not going to be. Now, maybe you would be in an enterprise. Maybe that is the expectation in the enterprise. And you maybe don't have as much variability because you don't have to worry about 30 products the way we do, right? So that's a different problem. But, so the point is you're going to have iterative problem. Like things are going to change. And this is why Agile effectively emerged, because Waterfall is the better idea. Waterfall is the natural way we all think about projects, right? There's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. And it's all like, we know what the scope is and we know what we'll have at the end. And that I think that's how we all kind of naturally think about things. It's how houses get built. It's how like it's just like naturally how people think about work. The reason that broke down beyond just consultants having something to sell is the reality is you can't plan ahead that well in a software world, because if you spend 6 months planning to do a 2-year project, that means, a month 17 in that project, you're still working off of assumptions, a year and a half, 2 years prior. And so, and in technology, they just change too fast. The market just changes
every 3 months.
So,
in 3 months, you could have a whole different experience. But if you're waiting,
look at the AI stuff. The AI stuff right now is changing every week. Like every week, somebody drops a product that's like, well, that has an impact. That this is not trivial, right? And it's like it's crazy. Like I was playing around last night with Sketch, the new thing from Google. You and I haven't even talked about this. I was just messing with it last night. Like you could generate entire UIs and all these different things and iterate with it. Now it's broken. To be fair, I got one iteration, and then I tried to do something, and it like just. They were clearly. But actually,
that's a really good point, though. That's a really good point, because I think so many places want to have the perfect experience. They want to have every decision that's perfect, spot on, and I want to deploy and release to customers something that is fully featured, robust. It's my MVP, but it's really a very robust, releasable product. But we need to be able to the old term of move fast to break things, is that, yeah, fine. If it's not perfect, that's okay. Just make sure that it's not so imperfect that it is unusable, but people are forgiving. I think that's something that is lost a little bit, is that if you have a good reputation for your customers, if you have a good relationship with the customers, they're going to forgive you if you don't have this wow product. People will see the light at the end of the tunnel and say, hey, you know what? It's not great right now, but I can see that they're making incremental improvements to it and iterating and making it better.
Yeah, we've certainly seen that in our product. Our customers are incredibly gracious with us because they see the vision of things that we're trying to do, and they tell us what they like and they tell us what they don't like, and they're not mad about the stuff they don't like. They just give us a chance to make it better. But like, if I think back to the enterprise, I watched this firsthand. I got put in charge of an initiative, which I eventually handed off to you, which was fun. But I got put in charge of this thing we called the startup. It was like the bank startup, and the idea was exactly this, right? Like, it was to break free of this multi-quarter, multi-year, set in stone plans. Everything's for the big PR release against my big strategic plan. We're trying to get away from that and deliver faster because as we all know, right, like in the enterprise, and at this bank, we actually started to measure it, and there started to be some real value. Like when you put an operating model together, and everybody always thinks about the engineering part, right? Like, because engineering is kind of engineering and testing are sort of the last legs in the they're the caboose of the train. But and so everybody's always, they're always the one that everybody's waiting on. I guess what I'm saying, right? But one of the cool things we started to do there as part of an operating model, I don't call it reform or an improvement or whatever, was to actually track every stage of these initiatives, right? So there was kind of the ideation stage, there was discovery stage, there was elaboration stage, and then there was the actual implementation development stage. And engineering would get involved a little bit, throughout those, but and more obviously as you got closer to implementation. Elaboration engineering was pretty involved in. Upstream of that, really just kind of consulted a little bit. But what that data showed was, because once we started putting good gates on those different stages and and had some real definition, was that, oh my God, everything takes 2 years. Well, actually, it takes like 4 months or 5 months to build the thing that takes 2 years. You spent an enormous amount of time in ideation and then discovery, right? Like, you didn't actually know what you wanted to do. You had an elevator pitch, but like why and what and all those different things. And then the elaboration piece and all. And so that was a really eye-opening thing to have that data after we ran it for a year or so. The business didn't receive it super well because it was really kind of an indictment of them, right? Like it looked from their perspective, it looked like we were just making excuses for things taking forever. And when reality, we're just in the data, it's like, hey, we're actually executing pretty tightly here. But that time frame is actually a very small percentage of the overall time frame of your initiative, but it's at the end, and so it always has this emotional and psychological feeling that it's what's holding everything up. And so what I learned in that process was the incentives. You would think the incentives are to do what we're talking about, iterative delivery, make sure we don't make mistakes, all those different things. Well, what I saw when we were running that startup was we actually built that product probably 4 times, like 4 different times. Like, we could have released it 4 or 5 times over. We couldn't get the business to decide what it was they actually wanted. And so we were constantly building things and building things and building things and building things. And it had to be perfect, but they didn't know what perfect meant, right? And so we were going through this constant iteration. And what I eventually sort of stormed off and like, I'm not doing this anymore, because I got frustrated and I was trying to make a point. Was I actually, what we ended up doing was saying, hey, the whole point of this startup was to break free of this thinking, but we don't also have the rigor and controls in place because we're trying to move fast, but the business won't shift their thinking. So let's just put it back in the main system, which is how it ended up in your hands. And what was really interesting to me is, like, once I realized, and it's been some time removed from it now, you see, there was a very senior business executive that had a vision for this idea. He had this idea, and it was going to be awesome. And it was going to be this grand strategic plan. And what we wanted to do was say, okay, well, let us take the very tiny, smallest slice of that and let's test it with 1,000 people. Like, they have millions of customers. Let's just add 1,000 of online banking users into a test group. We can use like Launch Darkly and things like that. And we'll expose it to them and we'll get feedback. And there was so much resistance to that. And, and it was never like, people don't just come out and say, look, we don't want to be measured. We don't want to have our hypotheses tested. But that's what the behavior said. The behavior was saying, we don't want to test our hypothesis because we actually talked about this before, right? Like, we're a company that runs on vibes and stories. And so if you bring data that's contrary to my vibe and my story, that's really bad for me. I don't want to, I'm going to either ignore or squash that. Right. And so that's not uncommon, right? So how do we help like we've both been through it now. Like, what's our advice to people that are dealing with that?
Well, to follow through on that story, because there's a longer tail of that when the team was handed over, and that's you kind of clued into this a little bit of not knowing exactly what perfect looks like, but it's walking back a little bit from that is what that really translates to is scope creep or scope change or anything else that wasn't right up front. Well, we're going to change that, but then engineering, why is it taking so long? But I don't think a lot of teams, a lot of groups measure the change orders, the change requests. Well, it was going to be 3 months, but because you asked for 4 new features, it's now going to be 6 months. It's now going to be 9 months. But those trade-off questions are never happening. And so that's what I found is that like we have all these vague requirements coming in because perfect wasn't defined. And so we had to really lock it into phases. Okay, based off of what we know right now, spell it out. This is our understanding. Here's the timing of what we're expecting. Okay, we good with that. Now, just so you know, we agree on this now. Every time you ask for something different, that this date is going to move. This is going to shift out. Anything that you ask, literally anything, just as an understanding that you ask for something new, there's going to be a shift. And so there's a little bit of a, oh, really? Yeah, really, because you're changing things. And so, there's not free time. Every bit of work, every line of code is time. Now, the code itself is easy, but then you have all of the other things that happen along with it. You've got to test it. You've got to run it through your automation. You've got to release it. You've got other teams that are going to be involved that, oh, I didn't think about that. Oh, okay. But what really helped that relationship is explaining all of those hurdles that a dev team has to go through to, it's a change, but look at all else we have to do to get it to the customers, to make sure it's a quality product, to make sure that the security audits have been done, to make sure it's safe to go to customers. And so really, approaching that with an open arms and say, hey, look, here's everything that we have to deal with as an engineering team. We have our own standards that we deal with. You've got your standards of usability metrics, user metrics, engagement. We have our own as well to make sure it's scalable, it's safe, it's secure. It's not going to expose any customer's data. It's not going to cause something else to break behind the scenes. And so really explaining to the business partners made them understand like, oh, okay, cool. Well,
So
let's walk together on this.
You're saying 2 different things and kind of mashing them together. So I want to tease them apart, right? So like one thing you're saying is you're trying to build 2-way empathy because you're trying to help them understand the organizational overhead of just doing technology in that type of an environment, all of the additional things you have to do, from a process and from a controls and all those different things. So you're saying, hey, like building that relationship is making sure, hey, I understand the problems that you have. You also need to understand the burdens that we have. And it's not just as simple as just, shipping some code, right? Like, and so helping them understand that. And then you're also talking about also helping them understand the impact of changes, right? And so putting together essentially a contract, not to be a contract, obviously, but like, you're making an agreement. Okay, we've got a fixed date and we've got fixed requirements. They're not going to move. If the requirements move, the date will move.
But those are related, though. I think those are very related. That the understanding that there's a lot that goes into making one change, that all the things that we have to go through. Yes, you might think it's like, well, why can't you just change this text coming back from the third party? Well, how do I know that's safe? How do I know that's going to work with everything? There's a lot more to that you have to understand as a business partner. It's not just one change. There's a lot that goes into understanding if that change is going to be safe.
Right? Like, I mean, this is the challenge, right? Like navigating. This is actually one of the things that most, I've watched a lot of app managers over the years. Managing this conversation with the business of impact of change and setting expectations around delivery and scope, is one of the harder things to do well in the space. And you do a really good job of it. You lean into a very dogmatic, very strict, point of view on that. Dogmatic's not quite fair to you, but you know what I mean? Like you're more on that end of the spectrum of, hey, if there's any change, the date's going to move, which isn't necessarily true, right? Like the change could actually reduce the scope, but you set that.
Let me be clear on that. Let me clarify that is that is the understanding to set. That's what I'm saying. You set that bar. You anchor there in a very, No, that's
kind
not
of
what I'm saying, though. That's not what I'm saying here. Is that that's the agreement to make. Like, understand that it's going to change. Now, it might not be true 100% of the time, but if you as a business partner think, I'm going to ask for a change, there is a likelihood of this pushing the date out. Maybe I'm not going to come to you with small, tiny, little nitpicky asks because it's likely to change something. Now, that doesn't stop the conversation from happening, but make sure that the agreement is there that it's probably going to shift something. Let's have this conversation versus just mandating it. Like, hey, can you absorb this? Is this something doable? Oh yeah, sure. But then you as the technology owner have the right to say, oh no, I can do this. Not a big deal. And you get that good faith effort to say, okay, cool. They can do it. They're acting as a good partner here because, the agreement was that changes would push out time, but you get that good faith of saying, we'll make it work for you because we'll work through things.
Yeah. So this is the balance, right? And it's like, it's all these things. It's you made a great point before, right? Like it's you got to build these relationships and rapport with people. If the first time you're having a really in-depth conversation is one of these moments and you haven't built any trust and you haven't built, like that's a problem, right? Like you have to understand each other. You have to be in sync. You have to, all those things. So like if you hit a moment about scope and timing and a disagreement about what that should be, and you haven't already set these guidelines and sort of these boundaries, then you're in trouble, right? And it's just going to be bad and you're going to end up over compromising. But at the same time, you don't want to ever get into a place where you're perceived fairly or unfairly as like, oh God, I don't want to talk to Duncan because if I bring up any change, it's going to be like, it's another month, right? Like, it's just going to be like, it's just my opportunity to pad the dates more. You don't ever want to give that impression either, because that's almost worse than being the people that are behind.
It's 100% worse. It's absolutely the worst case scenario. You don't want to be that because you won't ever get new opportunities because everything will, whether
they
it's
don't want to go to you because you're not a problem
so
solver.
Long. Right.
Yeah. So the key is, and this is kind of what I was saying before, even though I called you dogmatic, which wasn't really fair, or it wasn't really as precise as I'd like to be. But like my point is like, if you get really strict about articulating that dynamic up front,
yes,
it lets you be more flexible on the back end.
Exactly.
Right? But if you're flexible and squishy in the middle, then you're screwed, because then you're trying to say, okay, now we're in the tense situation and I'm going to try and lock it down. Blows up in your face, right? And then it gets escalated, and then your boss is telling you, or your boss's boss is telling you, get it done, right? And as opposed to, everybody understands this stuff's hard. You can't have a lot of variability because you're trying to do things on the most aggressive timelines as is reasonable. But then you can work with people, and then it's a totally different story if someone knows you're a tight shop, but you're going to try and stretch and make something work, versus you're kind of loose all over the place, but now you're trying to push back on the chaos that they're putting you on. And so, you and I have had this conversation many times over the years, right? Like, and trying to dial that in, trying to help, like, because again, we different personality types and we approach it a little bit differently, trying to hit the same place, but maybe from different angles. I think we both helped each other dial that in terms of those conversations with the business. Because again, it's about, are we going as fast as is responsible to go? Right. And is efficient. And like, we even had this conversation about our own stuff. Like what is it that we really care about? What we really care about is, like, it's easy to say ship fast and we just want to get value out. Right. But if we actually say, what are we truly trying to optimize? Well, we're truly trying to optimize delivering the right stuff well, as efficiently as possible. And so like that's actually what we're trying to optimize. Now, bigger companies, it's a more complicated arrangement because efficiency may not be actually the thing that matters. And efficiency can mean a lot of different things too. It could be cost, it could be time, it could be whatever. Like for us, it's a combination of, it's mostly time, right? Is what we're talking about. Is like, hey, as efficiently as means like, we don't want to go down blind alleys. We want to avoid blind alleys as much as possible, so we're not having to waste time. Like, we want everything we're doing to be as effective as possible. And so like that's kind of how we look at it. But I don't know. Is that how you think about it?
Yeah, I think you hit it there. And what I typically like to say to my teams is you aim for the ideal or perfection. Now that can mean a lot of different things, right? Perfection in this case is all changes at time, because fundamentally that's a true statement. But your acceptance for variability on that, or imperfection, so to speak, is the opportunity to make things work on a time that you've already committed to. Like changing a field, for example, is a silly example, but that's an acceptable variance for well, no, but in an enterprise context, it would be like, can you change this field? Yeah, it's going to take 2 weeks. That's the silly example. But in some cases, it might actually take an additional 2 weeks, because now in our example of adding a field, okay, what does that mean to add a field? Do you want to sort by it? Do you want to filter by it? That could take a lot more time, because it could be a lot of complexities on the back end. But you need to have that agreement with product and business to say, like, hey, come to me if you need a change, versus just jamming it in, because there are very commonly real things that could happen to extend the timeline. So now the same thing goes for your technology, because you still got to get your tech standards met in there too, because you're aiming for perfection. But in some of these cases where, okay, the business is asking for, to the same example, a new field. Now, ideally, we would do X, Y, Z technology-wise, but this really means a lot to them. This is going to help the product get better. We're going to take a couple shortcuts with our standards here. Maybe the query is a little bit dirty. Maybe it's a raw query that we would want to polish up. But if we take a little shortcut here, put a to-do or a story on the board for the future, we can make it work for them, get some good faith in there with them. And so then they've now given us the time in the future, once this project is live, let's come back and clean these things up. That's the true definition of a tech debt. But that's, I'm okay with that being imperfect for now. We'll come back to it in the future because we've negotiated. But we've also gotten a lot of good faith out of our business partners, knowing that we're going to work with them to deliver what's important to them. We talked about this before. It's building the relationships. It's building the reputational currency to say, hey, look, I'm going to go to Duncan. I'm going to go to Jason, because when I do, we have a real conversation that you're going to take some shortcuts. They're going to meet the need because it's that valuable to our customers. Or a common thing that I dealt with before was, well, I talked to so-and-so team. I won't name the names, but they told me it's going to be 6 weeks to do. Jason, I know this isn't ideal. I know this isn't your job. Can you work with me? Oh yeah, we'll get that done tomorrow. And that speaks volumes to not only your ability to work with them, but also it speaks volumes for your team's ability to get things done in a timely manner. So there's
never mind. That's super dysfunctional, right? Like you shouldn't decide which team to give, like which application work goes into based upon who's going to get it done faster. But I mean, it does happen, right? Because the business is just trying to get stuff done. They don't care about the right architecture and the data living in the right place and things like that. But to your point, it's a sign that you're doing things right, when that's what everybody wants you to get the work, right? Like when the business or the product organizations are trying to maneuver to get XYZ team working on their stuff, even though that team runs this application and not that application. It is a sign that there's a distinction going on there, that you've built that trust and whatnot. And one other thing to say, I think, telling myself a little bit here, right? Like, cause I think I'm about as friendly to, because I'm now like the business, right? Like if we're to kind of use, like you're the technology guy and I'm the business guy in our little dev grid thing, right? Like, and I'm about as empathetic to a technology team as most people are gonna be, because I've been there, still in there in some ways, right? Like, and so at the same time, I also fall into the same trap I'm about to describe, which is, what you really need to make sure you do as a technology leader, the thing you mentioned before about kind of like the change records, right? Like, hey, the scope has changed. We had an agreement on timeline. Now the scope has changed. That breaks that existing agreement, and we have to make a new agreement. Maintaining that, like if you've got delivery people or project management people that are working with you, great, make sure they do it. Like you have to maintain artifacts to that effect, because again, I'll point at myself, although there's a million other personas I could point at. Like I forget those things, right? Like all I see is why is this not done yet? Right? Like that's what goes through my brain, right? Like why is this taking so long? And that's just the normal, natural thing that happens to people that aren't in the weeds with you, that aren't having to deal with that reality of it takes so long because you changed your mind 15 times, buddy. Right? Like, because I'll forget about the 15 times I changed my mind. It's just like, this doesn't seem like it would be that hard. What are we doing? And of course, I become worse because I do actually can build the things. And so I make my own assumptions about what could be easy and not. which is obviously painful for others to have to deal with. But the point being, not in an organization like ours, it doesn't necessarily make sense because you can just yell at me. But at a bank or somewhere larger where it's cross-functional and all these different things, when you're in these important projects and things are happening like that, it's incumbent upon you as a leader to ensure that those agreements are being codified. And it doesn't have to be anything crazy. It could be an email, it could be a PowerPoint slide or whatever, just that you're putting like, okay, this was the agreement on this day, on June 1st, we said this was the scope, XYZ was the scope, and July 1st was the deadline. And we were going to hit that deadline. On June 7th, we said XYZ plus B is now the scope, and now the new date is July 7th or something, whatever, right? Like just keeping that and then putting that in a place where people can review and see the change log. Again, you could just use one document and just have it running and whatever, where there's a paper trail and the timestamp and all those different things. That goes a long way to be able to tell that story effectively.
But you have to have those communications with the individual asking for those changes, though, because if you just track 100%. Them yourself and they're not shared, who did you tell?
You got to do both.
You have to have, and also an agreement.
Because you're making a new agreement, right? Like yes. You can't just be like, hey, you gave me this scope, and so now I've set a new date. It doesn't work that way, right? Like you give me the scope, I tell you this is the date I think that would impact. Are we agreed? This is the new agreement. Like that you don't skip that step, right? You can't don't just absorb it and then be like, oh, well, I guess it will just take longer.
Yes, like no, please don't absorb it. I've learned a very hard way to not absorb it.
Yeah, I mean. It depends, but this is where whatever. But we'll get into that. But we don't need to get into that, I should say.
Please don't.
But yeah, don't. You have to have the conversation, and because the other thing is, and this is something I remember you were getting critiqued. You were getting criticized. This was years ago now, but you were getting criticized for being too rigid, right? And it's like, and like almost one of those things where it's like, hey, you were always on time. Right? Like you never missed your dates, which if you never miss your dates, you're probably, not being aggressive enough in your timelines, right? Like that type of concept. And I remember defending you to kind of a shared leader. And I remember my point was like, Jason has just figured it out, right? Like if you try to play hero ball as a leader and fail because you tried to do something unrealistic, but got close, but didn't quite hit it, but you're still behind or whatever, no one will remember that the thing was unrealistic. All they'll remember is you failed, right? Versus if you sort of, it's not protectionist, but it's like the incentive is to say, I'm only going to agree to things that are realistic. I'm not going to just absorb it, like you say, right? I'm only going to agree to things that are realistic because on the back end, none of you people are going to remember that this was unrealistic. You're just going to say, did they hit it or not, right? And that's not even calling out those people. Like it just is what it is. It's human behavior, right? And so understanding that's a tough line to walk, right? Like balancing those things to saying, hey, like, how do you be flexible? How do you not be that person who's padding so you always hit your date? At the same time, how do you not put yourself in a situation where you look like a schmuck, even though it's not really your fault, right? And so how do you do that and balance it? I think it comes back to ultimately kind of what you're saying, which is, try to do the best thing for the company and for the value, right? Like pushing really hard can work, but if it puts everybody in a situation where it's a low likelihood of success, that's not a good decision if in that culture, right? Like in a place like a bank, banks need predictability and high likelihood of success. They don't need hero ball. It's not what their culture demands. Obviously, be as aggressive as possible, but don't try to, don't try something that is just a swinging for the fences. It's not, they are the king of Moneyball, right? Like they just, I want to get walks. I want to get singles and doubles and steals. And like those types of companies know your culture, know where you're at. Like, are you at a place that appreciates home runs, or are you a place that appreciates on base percentage? Because those are different places. And, and if you're a leader and you see people being too protectionist, like there's also a thing to look at and say, okay, let's take the extreme ownership thing. Like they're being too protectionist. What am I doing that's not making them feel safe enough to take any risks, right? And so, and how do we communicate that? How do we change that dynamic to where, they're risking enough that they miss their dates 10% of the time or 15% of the time, right? like I think we talked about this before, but I can't remember the I remember reading or hearing about some company, some bank talking in like the earnings call or something like that. And this has just stuck with me for decades, but they were saying like, hey, we didn't lose enough money on our credit, like our credit defaults.
Yeah. I think we talked about that last time.
Yeah. It's
and so it's the same being thing. Perfect is bad. Being perfect is I've had this conversation with a few of my leaders in that they say they want to hit their dates because they're put into a position where they're being asked to do a lot. And so they're being asked to hit specific dates because there's that domino effect of things. And so they have the natural desire to be, okay, I'm going to tell you what I think I can hit, or I'm highly confident, 95+% confident I can hit, because if I don't, based off of the reinforcement learning is that if I don't hit that, there's going to be a domino effect. And so they give what they think is a high probability of success. And so I would have this conversation with them and keep bringing up the feedback that I received is that hitting 100% of your dates is bad. And it kind of blows their mind. And I think we've talked about this before, but it's that you just need to be 80% of the time. Aim for 80% that you're right. Aim for the big things, of course, but it's okay to miss a little bit.
You made a really good point though, like understand if you miss your date, are there ripple effects, right? Like if there's a stagger where like you've got to get this done so these guys can get this done, so these guys can get this done, like those dates are more those are more success sensitive, right? And so understand, is this a date we can be aggressive on, or is this a date we have to hit? And like those things, that's a really important distinction you made.
And if you're right, if you're saying that you have to hit every single one, you're wrong.
Yeah.
You just either you're wrong with how you're staging, you're staggering your work, or you're wrong with your understanding of the importance of things. And so my advice would be to either, if you don't know what's important, start having those conversations with your manager, with your business partners to know, like, hey, how critical is this that I get this out right in this date? You'll be surprised to know that sometimes it's not critical at all. They just put something out there because they had to. And so, oh yeah, I don't care about that for 6 months. Oh, okay, well, I'm not going to work on it for 4. I'm going to push that out. So it's building those relationships where you can have those conversations of asking, well, how important really is this? Because I've asked that and, I don't even know why it's on the board.
Yeah.
You don't even need to do that.
No, for sure. So let me I want to ask you. I forget. There's like a law, like Murphy's Law or whatever. There's like a law. I forget what it is. I should look these things up before. But it's basically the idea is that work will expand and meet the time allotted, right? So if you give somebody a month to do something, even if it's a 3-day task, it might take a month to do it, right? So how do you think about, because it's just normal, natural human psychology. How do you think about, again, not necessarily in our context, because our context is different, but like back in like a big company, a big enterprise, the appropriate level of urgency? How do you manufacture the appropriate level of urgency on work? Because to your point, like maybe it doesn't need to get done in 7 days, but actually it's only 3 days worth of work. Like how do we make sure to keep the team humming in a way that keeps them in the most degree of sustainable effectiveness?
Yeah. That's hard to answer unilaterally because there's no one size fits all to that. It's
sure.
Typically it's cluing the team in with the company's or the organization's mission. What I found is that the closer the dev team gets to knowing what the success is in the bigger picture and knowing why does this work matter? It's just, I'm changing something. Why does it even matter? But the more they understand that, the more they see those ripple effects, the more they see the compounding effects, the more they see what it happens to the customer. Oh yeah, I want to fix that because I can see how that would be frustrating, or I can see how that would be useful. And it's to that startup team is that they were closer to the business and they saw how much this is going to affect the customer. And so I've never seen a team more engaged with wanting that product to be successful. I mean, there's passion with that. And so to some of even the API teams that were a little bit more removed, the more they were understanding, why does this matter? Why does this fit in with the big picture? The more they were able to not only be more enthusiastic about the work, but suggest improvements to it. Like, well, what if we do this instead? Oh, well, you just saved us 2 weeks of time. Awesome. Thank you. So it's involving everybody. There's some people who won't see that big vision, but it's never too early to see and be exposed to why does your work matter. And so it sounds a little squishy, but that's the reality though. people need to know, why does their work matter? How is this impacting the customer? And so they will build their own urgency to say, well, I want to fix that because as a customer, I can see why that would be painful. And so it's less urgency, but more of helping everybody see how their work rolls into, the end result for the customer. It builds its own urgency.
Yeah. Okay. So you're saying more of a pull than a push. It would be another way to say that, right?
You can push all you want, but it doesn't work. It never works.
I wouldn't say it never works. It's just because it does work for sure.
Short term.
Do you get a sustainable environment, and are people truly motivated by that, or are they just being, is it fear versus being energized and things like that?
Yeah. I mean, there's a time and a place for that, right? There's a time and a place for a push. Hey, I need you to work this weekend. We are so close. Please just work this weekend and let's just get this done. Okay, fine. Run the red line a little bit. That's not sustainable. When I say it doesn't work long for the long haul.
So you're talking about healthy teams, right? Like you're talking about healthy teams who are motivated, who have visibility, but like, as we know, the vast majority of software development teams in these large enterprises don't have that type of environment, right? Where they feel connected to the business value and all those different things. They're seven layers away from the customer, and they're just being given tickets and projects to sort of execute. Like in that context, if you got dropped into, we've got some of our customers and we have some awareness of how they do things, right? Like you get dropped into a team like that. What are some of the quick steps you could make to start to try to create that sense of ownership that is kind of provides intrinsic motivation, as opposed to I got to do this to keep my job motivation?
It depends on your role. Are you the manager? Are you a developer? Are you?
Yeah, I mean, you as an manager, right? Like if I dropped you on one of our customers' teams that we know of, issues or whatever legacy problems that they have, what would you, where would you start?
You start just talking to your team, understanding what they know, where they see things, and trying to understand what their vision is, because there's a large gap between what the team understands as their mission and what your manager in that role understands as the mission. And so it's just reconciling, where are the gaps? Like, what do you know? What do you think you know? What is the reality? And start to reconcile the vision of things. You might have a person who says, well, my job is to build APIs. Okay, that's technically true, but that's not what you're really doing. You're building a platform that manages APIs. Oh, okay. It's just reconciling the gaps.
Yeah.
That's got to be step one at any time.
Well, so this is good. So I think maybe we can end on this, right? Because I think this is actually a nice segue. We've been talking about, because like one of the things we do, we often will do for our customers, and I've done it, you and I both have done it at multiple companies, is this idea of like a team charter. So maybe we put a pin in this conversation, wrap for today, but then maybe next time we come back and we actually let's talk about the team charters, because I think that's a great segue of like kind of what that exercise looks like and how it can help with some of these issues. So, anything else on this topic before we wrap?
I think that's it. We've filled it.
All right, sweet. Well, very good. Thanks again for the time. It's good to see you. And thanks everybody else for sticking around. And we'll talk to you again soon. Cheers.
That's a wrap for this episode of Tech Council, brought to you by DevGrid. Thanks for joining us as we dive into building smarter solutions for the enterprise. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, leave us a rating, and share your thoughts on X, at DevGrid Inc., or at devgrid.io. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll explore more ways to thrive in the enterprise. Until then, keep building.